Hello and welcome. It's great to see everyone start joining this morning or afternoon, wherever you are. I'll give you a minute while we wait for people to get situated and connected. And in the meantime, I'm going to launch our first poll because I'm always excited to see, what's bringing you here today. Is it educational? Are you in the beginning stages of your TPRM program? Maybe a current prevalent customer? Let me know. And in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and get some intro started. My name is Melissa. I work here at Prevalent Business Development, and today we are joined by a returning guest, Bryan Littlefair, who is the past global CISO of Vodafone Group and Aviva. Welcome back, Bryan.
Great to be here. Thank you for the invite.
Good. Didn't scare you off yet, so that's great. And last but not least, we do have Scott Lang, our very own VP of Product Marketing. Hi, Scott.
Hey, Melissa.
As a little bit of housekeeping, this webinar is being recorded. So you'll get this along with a slideshow shortly after the webinar as we, dive into the 5 strategies for efficient vendor onboarding. Make sure if you do need to communicate something that's not a question for the Q&A box, use the chat, but try to use the Q&A box and let it be as interactive as possible. And without further ado, I will let Bryan jump into it. Go ahead.
Great, thanks, Melissa. And it's great to be back talking around one of my favorite topics, third-party risk management. And today we're going to be focusing on strategies for efficient vendor onboarding, which is a really critical component, because if you don't get the onboarding correct, then the risk decisions and risk metrics that you take based on that onboarding further down the line just won't be accurate. So I want to set the scene a little bit first of all. So it's amazing how many organizations I see that really haven't got a functioning enterprise risk capability. And most of you on the call must be saying, well, we do, and that's great. But, all organizations, I think, need to make sure that they have that end-to-end holistic enterprise risk function operating effectively and capably throughout the organization. Regardless of size and scale, it's something that we absolutely have to have in place going forward. And I think, government agencies around the world, communicating to the citizens and organizations within their countries that the risk from cyber threat, especially coming through the the third-party supply chain, is absolutely, prevalent and critical. And we all need to factor that into our risk-based decisions, and we'll weave that through in the conversation today. And focusing on what we're talking about at the moment, third-party security. Organizations that I see, I do a lot of consultation, some very large multinational organizations, some governments, but equally small to medium enterprise, charities, academia, etc. They all have some form of supply chain within their organizational structure. And it really depends on the importance of how they treat the third-party security within that life cycle and how they manage it and, do the full life cycle management throughout it. And I see some that take it extremely seriously, have the right resources in terms of people, process, etc., focused at it. But equally, I see some that just want to tick the box. And, hopefully we have people on the call today that want to take it seriously. And I'm going to hopefully give you some of my experience on how to do the onboarding correctly, so that the ongoing activity you take forward from that will reap rewards for your organization. But then equally, it's around tooling. So obviously I don't work for Prevalent, but I have been a customer of their product for numerous years in many organizations that I've run security for. And I think we're definitely beyond the world of Excel. And many organizations are still trying to manage their third-party risk management using Excel. Excel's a great product. It has its purpose within an organization, but it's definitely not to manage third-party risk. We're far too complex. We need data in near real time. We don't need legacy spreadsheets, etc. So we really need to recognize that we have to invest in that tooling to be able to give us the knowledge, the insights that we need to be able to effectively manage risk, not just cyber risk, but risk within our supply chains going forward. So that vendor onboarding, obviously I've said it's a critical process to establish a company as an approved provider, and it really is. It's the same with anything in security, really. If you're putting a security operations center into your organization, the onboarding is the critical component. It tells, obviously, an external tool or an external supplier what they need to know about your organization. in the third-party risk management world, we need to know absolutely everything. You know, it sounds a little bit mundane, but we need to know absolutely everything about that organization. Who owns it? What geographies do they operate in? What, you know, capabilities or technologies do they sub out to fourth and fifth or N vendors down the track? Which geographies do they operate in? Where does their data reside, etc.? So we really need to know all of that information on the onset, but there's a lot more in as well, which we'll get in later in the deck. So why all of this focus onto onboarding? And I've explained a little bit about it being, you know, such a critical step. But if I see, you know, all too often incidents and issues happening within the supply chain, and, you know, when they go back and retrospectively look at what they knew about that supplier, they didn't perhaps know that they operated in that geography. They didn't perhaps know that their data was being outsourced for other people to work on it from within that organization. So it really is critical that we get all of that information up front, and we can codify that into our platforms and tools, and make sure that we can run our risk models across that and check that we're happy with that. And equally, we have a lot of, you know, compliance and regulation coming in that are forcing us down that track as well. And, you know, please look at one of the other webinars I did for Prevalent that really focuses down on the compliance and regulatory elements that we're forced to go down as well. But really looking at, you know, some of the key objectives that we're trying to deliver, and this diagram kind of looks like opposing forces, but it's not. It's really about how do we work together collaboratively as a, you know, holistic business to deliver the outcomes that we want to give our customers. So risk mitigation is obviously what we're looking at. It's not just cyber risk, it's, you know, risk in general. So getting that onboarding right is really, really critical. You know, it can help us mitigate data breaches, data loss, regulatory and compliance issues. It really gives us that radar of information that all of the business, not just the security teams, so the legal teams, the procurement teams, you know, the business relationship teams, the line of business teams, they're all going to consume this information that we're going to present to them further down the track. So we need to make sure that they're set up for success. And obviously we get that information right from the outset. Compliance, we've touched upon it briefly, but, you know, sitting here in Europe, well, actually the UK technically isn't part of Europe anymore, but we're still, you know, part of the GDPR regulation. In the US, you have things like CCPA, etc. But regulation isn't going to go away. If anything, it's only going to increase. So we need to make sure that we've got, you know, a full and true understanding about our compliance obligations. If we're selling products and services to citizens in certain countries, there's over 80 different data security requirements around the globe at the moment. And organizations and countries that, you know, reside in some of those legislative environments have to make sure that they're complying to those individual nuanced requirements. And it does get complex for a large global multinational, but, you know, using a tool like Prevalent can help you navigate that complexity. And again, if you're trying to do it yourself using a tool like Excel or, you know, Word documents, etc., it really does become a challenge to try and navigate that landscape. You know, what we're looking at is quality, and I think quality and security go hand in hand. We want a quality outcome. We want to deliver a quality service to our business customers. We need to be able to ensure that we're not being the security blocker. All too often, and, you know, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, but this individual process in an organization, if not done correctly, can be a real blocker. You know, the procurement function can see it as slowing things down. You know, they're ready to do a deal, but the security checks haven't been done. The security team have sent out a questionnaire. The organization has to fill that in, it then has to be returned. It has to be analyzed. The risk quantification has to be done across it. And then obviously the dialogue and communication with the business, and all that can take time. But, and if it's a new supplier, more importantly, you're starting with a blank sheet of paper. But what we're starting to see, obviously, with tools like Prevalent is that when you start that communication with the business and they say, we want to start a relationship with company XYZ, in all likelihood, someone on the Prevalent platform has already got a relationship with that business. So when you start to, you know, input some of the details onto the platform, you start to see information that's relevant to your risk quantification flowing through straight away. So you're not starting with that blank sheet of paper waiting for that response to come through from, you know, the end customer or client. We also want to protect our company's reputation. You know, one of my past CEOs used to not describe us as a security function. We were described as the brand preservation function. So they invest, you know, multiple millions in promoting the organization through marketing and advertising. And the biggest damage that can occur is, you know, a data breach, and they're on the front pages of the newspapers for the wrong reasons. So we want to make sure that we're protecting that brand, we're protecting that reputation. And, you know, our customers come to us and they entrust us with their data, their location data, their payment information, their home address, their date of birth, some very sensitive information. And they're hoping and hoping that we've put the, you know, proactive security controls in to protect them going forward. But in all cases, that's not true. So what we're talking about today is making sure that we put those processes in place so that we're effective in doing that going forward. Business agility is really critical here as well. As I said, we don't want to create that security silo and that security blocker. We need to work collaboratively with the business. And I do see this function or operation sitting within the security function. And often we can create the security silo. And that leads me quite nicely onto the next slide where we discuss how we achieve this. So again, I did another PowerPoint presentation for Prevalent, and you should look at that one as well, which talks about, you know, how we really embed this function, this process into, you know, the broader business, working effectively with the procurement function, the legal function, etc. But if you are a security professional on the call, you know, you're not alone. What we need to do is get this process running holistically across the organization. And we need to build in our risk levers. You know, we want to know as much about these organizations as quickly as possible. And what we have are things like our RFI, our RFP processes, where we can start to codify requirements very early into the relationship and discount suppliers that don't meet our security requirements or perhaps don't meet our CSR requirements, etc. So we can start to ask those questions early and upfront, so we can make sure that anyone who's perhaps a finalist to be a supplier to our organization actually is pretty good and meets the majority of our requirements up front. But in order to do that, we can't do that solely within security. You know, we need to identify who our stakeholders are. We need to get them involved in the procurement process. So, you know, that's the full breadth of the business. So it's the security team, it's the legal, it's the IT team, etc. Each of these different stakeholders are going to have a different perspective on, you know, what a secure supplier means to them. And we need to capture those requirements. So that means working with those stakeholders, get their specific, you know, operational requirements. Me being a security leader, you know, I have specific security controls that I would expect. I'd expect them to, you know, comply to all the requirements with my security policy. But the IT team are going to have a different set of requirements. They're going to, you know, have their technical requirements that relate to how the systems are operated, the 24/7 capability, how the software is being procured, the licensing, you know, the patching and the updating and all of those aspects. So it's important that we hear those different voices and we capture them into our onboarding process. And as I said, you know, pulling those levers early, so incorporating those requirements into our RFI, RFP processes. Once they've been established, we push them out as part of our initial documentation. They can see that we've set our stall out really early. These are our expectations. This is what we require. You know, we can discount suppliers that don't meet those requirements. So that's a really critical lever that we can pull very, very early. This can't be an iterative, sorry, it has to be an iterative process. It can't be static. So it's not something that we create, we push into the organization and that's it done. It's the same with everything else in security. It has to be living, it has to be breathing, it has to react. And that's why, again, using something like Prevalent that can bring in the threat angle is really important to us. So we're not just talking risk here, we're talking threat. So an organization's threat profile, depending on, you know, the sector it operates in, the geographies that it operates in as well, that threat posture can change on a daily basis. When the threat changed, the risk changes as well. So if we're only looking at threat, then obviously we're not going to really, have an accurate risk position. We really need to factor in that threat dynamic as well. So that review and revise is absolutely really critical. We need to constantly evolve to make sure that, the process is meeting the business needs. And how do we do that? We need to communicate regularly. And, I will say, honestly, being a security professional, this is one of the areas that we often fall down on, being open and transparent with the broader business. We need to break down those security silos. We need to get the security team out from behind the security speed gates and really embedded and working with the broader business. We need to verify and validate that our services that we're running on behalf of them are meeting their requirements and needs. And if they're not, we need to adapt and change that process, because even though this is quite often seen as a security process, it's actually delivering that capability and service for the whole business. So we need to factor in those requirements and voices and adapt and react as appropriate. So what we need to do is, not all suppliers are equal. And let me just build this slide. So what we're talking about here is inherent risk scoring. So what do I mean by inherent risk scoring? That's our vendor evaluation process, and it can really make sure that we're focusing what are finite resources in terms of people and budget and capability on those vendors that really matter. Every organization is going to have a spread of vendors that support them. There's going to be people that deliver ingredients for the kitchen and the canteen for the employees. And there's going to be people that manage the privileged access in the data center, etc. So there's two, opposing ends of the spectrum that will dictate how much effort and resource we focus on from a security perspective. So we need to identify those risk factors. So where are we going to spend our time and resource? And it's fairly normal and typical to tier the suppliers that deliver services and products for our organization. So again, that's working with the security team, so the broader experts within the security team and the stakeholders within the business to identify the criticality of this supplier. What are the products and services that they're going to be delivering for us? What level of access are they going to have? Is it logical? Is it physical? Are we going to be sending them customer data, or are they going to be accessing customer data on our sites? There's a whole host of factors that kind of dictate to us how much effort we need to put into assessing the risk that they pose to us. And once we've done that, obviously we need to assign our risk scores. We need to land them within a segment. Particular segments, tier 1 suppliers means that they might get an on-site visit, whether it's by our organization personally or someone that does that on our behalf. But obviously, even using the Prevalent platform, it dictates how much effort and detail we put in there to understand the true risk that organization presents to us. That certainly doesn't mean that we ignore those in tier 3. I've seen definite situations before, and the reason I use the canteen example is I've seen organizations breached by platforms that perform basic tasks that could be perceived as basic tasks, but they still have access to tools and platforms within the organization. So it doesn't mean that all of our focus goes into tier 1 and we ignore tier 3. That risk assessment has to be holistic, and we still have to understand the level of access and data access they have within our organizations. So we use all of that, the tiering, the risk factors that we've captured to really identify those risk lever points. So what are our critical pinch points? How could our organization be compromised? What would that look like from a risk perspective, and how do we codify that into our requirements? It's fairly typical for an organization to just generically say, we expect you to comply to our entire security policy, which is an individual approach. But you are going to have to tailor that for certain suppliers. If you're outsourcing the management of your data center, for example, that becomes a lot more sensitive conversation, and you just have to comply to our security requirements. That means you really get into the detail around how are things actually performed, who are the people that are going to be performing those tasks. It's really getting down into that detail. And then we obviously have to evaluate our vendors. So hopefully at this stage, we've got a little bit of a short list. We've weeded out those that aren't going to meet our criteria. And we've got a short list of 3 or 4 vendors that can absolutely meet our requirements, but we need to know a little bit more information about them. So in that RFI, RFP process, we're not going to know everything about their financials. We're not going to know everything about their ownership models, for example. So this is getting broader than cyber, but it helps to build that end-to-end holistic, risk picture. So we really need to get into that detail as well. And often we're focused down on cybersecurity, but as you'll see weaved throughout this presentation, in order to really capture the risk, we have to go broader. And we have to adjust and amend. As I've said before, this is an evolving process, and threat plays a key role in here as well. A key supplier one day might become a non-key supplier the other day. Looking at things like the Russian conflict, I previously supported many organizations that had business units operating in Russia. Geopolitical conflict, really changes how we procure and, the suppliers that are approved within our supply chain. And for example, the current conflict or potential conflicts that are occurring in China, what would happen if we had to decouple our entire supply chain from China? We have to think through these models in advance and understand, if we're starting business relationships with people, not only what are our suppliers, but what are their suppliers and where do they operate? So we have to, as I said at the beginning, really get into the detail. So the key message here is, we can't wait till the end of the process. Again, it's like other security processes. We want to be proactive. We want to start early. We don't want to be, developing software and people can do what they want, and then we just do a penetration test at the end. It's exactly the same here. We want to start those questions early, understand really what is the risk that's presented to us, so we can get that onboarding done effectively, and obviously support us going forward. So what are, we want to, identify and mitigate, some of those top onboarding risks. So what do I see out there on a daily basis? What do I think some of the top risks that I see and people tripping over? First of all, 100% coverage. So large global multinationals, it gets complex. For example, your business unit in the USA might use a supplier for, services X, Y, Z. Your business unit in France might use the same supplier for services A, B, C. You need to have that global holistic view. All too often, you've got a siloed view, or you haven't got the full picture, and your suppliers aren't going to help you here. I mean, this is my, pessimistic view, but having, ran security for large global multinationals, some suppliers play on that. They will slice and dice you. They will, give you different price points in different countries. It's not in, their best interests to actually say, here's everything that we do for you, and here's our global services, and here's the prices you pay in all your various different countries. So if they can, leverage that lack of global capability that perhaps you have, then some will, certainly not all, but some will. So we need to have that ability to get that global view. And how do you do that? So it's around, centralizing your procurement, centralizing your cost centers, so you can see any spend that is related to, finance or IT or security is going through some form of centralized choke point. So you can start to pull that global view of spend and suppliers together. So that 100% coverage is absolutely key. And equally, I've seen incidents happen where, people just haven't realized that they've been using that supplier in that country. And again, that's where they've been trying to use that manual process that we've discussed before. And I think we have to leverage the innovation that's actually occurred in this space. And I have operated personally in that Excel world simply because, I've got some slightly gray hairs now, and, I lived in a world where these platforms weren't available, and we had to run Excel tools and platforms, and it gets very complex. And often in security teams, this area is a stretch from resource and focus. So we need to help them out as much as we can. So if you've got 2 or 3 people trying to manage 2,500, 3,000 suppliers globally using Excel, they're going to struggle. But if actually you've got 2,500, 3 people that are focused on a platform that's been purpose built to manage, risk, compliance and threat within the supply chain, that can work. So, it's around, giving them the ability to succeed and setting them up for success. That's absolutely key. One of the other things I see is, the lack of due diligence. So the lack of breadth and depth. So it's making sure, again, that we've got that tiering done effectively from the outset, making sure that we understand the full scope of services that this organization is going to deliver to us, making sure that we're not falling foul of, compliance in terms of inadequate contract terms. GDPR, CCPA, or any of the other 78 data requirements around the world dictate to us that if we're outsourcing, if we're offshoring, if we're letting other people manage, manipulate, interact with our customers' data, then we have to be, put in the right controls and processes. And part of that is, defining who is the data owner, which would always be us, and who is the data processor, etc. And, putting in place the governance and the contractual terms and clauses that both parties fully and truly understand their roles and responsibilities. And this isn't just covering us off from a legal perspective, it's doing the right thing on behalf of the customer, because we're setting that relationship up very clearly from the outset. If you have access to our data, here are our expectations, they are non-negotiable, and here's the governance and the KPIs and the KRIs and the monitoring and the reporting that we expect on a varying frequency to make sure that we can check that you are adhering to those requirements and processes up front. It sounds mundane, it sounds onerous, but that's the world that we have to operate in to make sure that the suppliers that we're working with are doing the right things that we've promised on behalf of our customers. The other thing I see is no life cycle management, and this is, especially prevalent, but not prevalent in terms of the application. Prevalent in terms of what I see out there in the marketplace. If you're running a manual process and you are sending out questionnaires and you're capturing those and analyzing them and building Excel spreadsheets up, etc., what we see, or certainly what I noticed in the past, is as soon as that information is received, you can pretty much disregard it because it's out of date. And if we all think about our own organizations and how much they change, how much they morph, almost on a daily basis, new products and services are launched, new management, new approaches, new tactics, new strategies, new geographies that you're operating in. If you're only interacting with that customer once per year to send them a questionnaire, you've got 364 days of lag before you might pick up, something that is actually a fairly material risk to you and to your data. Perhaps they've made their own choices to outsource and offshore part of their organization. And if you haven't got the right contractual terms set up that they have to pre-notify you in advance of material changes like that, then you might not discover it for almost a year. So it's around, how do you make sure that you've got those hooks and those levers and, the contractual requirements and the appropriate governance to be able to detect changes that are really critical to managing the risk within your supply chain. And that really leads us on to having meaningful metrics. And I've seen some pretty awful reporting, and I'll show you one on the next slide, but it's, what do we need? And I think about this slightly differently. Rather than saying, here's our entire security policy, and each one of them has a KRI, and each one has a control, and each one has a KPI, etc. So you end up getting, a 400-page KPI report coming back from suppliers, and it's really difficult to see the wood from the trees. It's really focusing down on what are those meaningful metrics, what are those lead and lag KPIs that would, switch the light on for us immediately that this is an area that we want to show more focus and attention. So there's some, fairly upfront thought that needs to go into this in terms of, what is this service? What criticality is it to the organization? Therefore, what metrics do we want to be able to get from this supplier to make sure that they're doing what we expect them to do? And ultimately, we're not exposing our organization to downstream compliance or risk, and that we've covered that off proactively. Because that's ultimately what we're trying to do here. We don't want to be reactive. No one wants to see, one of their suppliers on CNN or Sky News or something similar having a breach without us knowing about it, without us seeing that has the potential capability to happen. So, if a supplier isn't doing their perimeter patching, then that's a pretty good indicator that they're going to have issues. So we need those hooks and levers to detect that early so we can, terminate that relationship and move our, contracts to someone that takes security more seriously going forward. So, and that's why, this area can be challenging, because, you magnify that by 2,500, 3,000 vendors more in some cases, it can become a bit of a challenge, but using the tools can really help. So when I said I've seen some, awful examples of reporting, this is a bit of a mock-up, but it's, it's very similar to something that I've seen in reality. And this, can go on for pages and pages. And, it's really impossible to see the wood from the trees. So you've got your list of suppliers down the left. You've got, your critical security policy, themes or control groups along the top. And then obviously a very complex matrix with, so many more colors in the mix. It's really impossible to understand what it's really trying to tell us. And, if this is presented to a board member or an executive or even a business stakeholder, you're requiring them to do the analysis on the fly in terms of, well, what is that control, and, how important is it to us? And that's not their job. It's our job as security professionals to do that on their behalf and present them, clear, concise information around, here are our recommendations based on this risk. Here's what we're recommending doing. So obviously the one on the left, it's, it's static. It's an Excel spreadsheet. You can try and click on a box, but, it's not going to do anything. It's out of date as soon as it's produced. And, using this process, probably these suppliers, as I said, are only touched once a year. So that information isn't changing on a regular frequency. But we need to adopt a better way, and there is a better way. So, codifying, and ultimately that's what we do. We codify our security policies into platforms and tools like Prevalent. We tell it what we take seriously, what we see as critical, what we're more flexible on, what we see as major risks, what we see as minor risks, what our threat posture is, etc. And the tool will do the analysis for us. It will, pinpoint within our supply chain where we need to focus, where are the key threats and risks, what conversations do we have to have with the business. And the key thing is we can start to drill down into data sets. So we start high level, but we can go low level. So we can sit down with a business stakeholder and we can say, look, we're having this issue with a supplier. And you can introduce that geopolitical angle here as well, or you can use other examples like the Suez Canal being blocked, or the horse meat scandal in Europe. So there's, various other factors that would change the risk profile of a potential supplier, depending on what your business is. If you're a financial services business and perhaps you've outsourced your PCI compliance to a third party and they've started caching CVVs, then, that's a major risk for you. If you make meat pies and all of a sudden you've discovered one of your suppliers has, been introducing horse meat, as was happening in Europe, again, that's, a key risk that's going to present itself in your organization. So I realize there's a full dichotomy of organizations on the call. So this really does get down into sector specifics in terms of, what is actually important for me and what are the things that I really want to look out for as well. So, what metrics should we be measuring? What do I see as important going forward? So risk, of course, we want that to be balanced. We want it to, not be focusing on lead and lag. We want, it to be informed. We want it to be quantifiable. We want it to be repeatable. And what I mean by repeatable is using an Excel spreadsheet. If you put that in front of analyst A or analyst B, you're going to get a different outcome. You're not going to get a repeatable risk quantification or risk assessment. So we're humans. We analyze data in different ways. We have different biases, for example. So we need to remove those as much as possible and make sure that we're getting a quantifiable, repeatable risk decision that is, uniform throughout the organization. And it's based on, best practice frameworks. So obviously organizations use different frameworks. So whether you're using NIST or, you're using standard of good practice, whether you're using ISO or, whether you're using any of the other frameworks as well, you need to be able to relate those controls and control failures to those frameworks as quickly as possible. But ultimately, we want to know how to positively influence that risk position. We are the custodians of risk in this space for the business. We've got delegated accountability to, capture risk, give recommendations, treat that going forward. Threat is a major angle that is introduced by using these platforms, and threat is a game changer, and absolutely we shouldn't discount the importance of bringing threat in. A good example that I've used is, I was working with a bank in Europe that had, spent a significant amount of money on security transformation, and they expected to see their risk profile reduce significantly. But actually, when you overlay the threat dynamic, what was happening in that sector, actually their risk profile hadn't gone down a lot. And that's for logical reasons, because risk and threat are inherently linked, and we can't just use our standard 9-box quadrant and say, right, we've delivered a process or we've delivered a technology, therefore our risk has come down. Because we operate in a world with shifting sands. We operate in a world with different threat dynamics, and we need to make sure we've captured that into our decision making. And one of the things with Prevalent is it captures that threat. It understands, it has those hooks and levers in terms of what's going on with individual suppliers, and we get that view in near real time, something that again you're not going to get with your manual process. And compliance, we need that context driven compliance. We need to understand what we've committed to. Where are we operating within? What jurisdictions are we operating in? Because they are all different. If you compare GDPR to MAS in Singapore, for example, or CCPA, or the Indian or the South African legislations and jurisdictions, if we have some form of breach, we all in those jurisdictions have to operate in a slightly different way. How quickly do we notify regulators? What's the process of communicating with customers? We need to make sure that we are compliant to that, not just for a regulatory, but to do the right thing for our customers. And we've all seen, organizations that have had some form of issue or breaches, and, even though the breaches occurred, organizations and customers can understand if the communication is very clear, very concise. And we've seen, organizations handle issues and breaches very well. And we've seen organizations brush breaches under the carpet and handle them very poorly as well. So yes, we need to look at compliance, but equally we need to do the right things from our customers. And then the coverage is absolutely key. And, I'm stressing this, I know I've covered that before as well, but it's again an issue that I see within, some of the programs that I go and look at, is that we've only got partial coverage, and partial coverage means partial risk. It means partial threat, and it means that we're not giving the business that holistic view that they need to have. So this needs to be a global process. So wherever your organization operates, it might not just be a sales operation, etc. You might have engineering divisions in different business units and different countries, but this process needs to run holistically end to end so that you've got no gaps. Because, regardless where they operate, they will have some form of supplier, whether that's a landlord for a building, a cleaning contract, etc. They all need to be factored into this process in some way, shape, or form. Okay, so what are some of the key KPIs specifically within the onboarding process that I think we should look at? So vendor performance is absolutely key, and by this I mean something like, what are their SLAs? What are we going to hold them to account from? What compliance are they liable to and are going to pass towards us? What are things like their response times? What are their quality ratings, etc.? So we need to make sure that we're working with someone credible fundamentally. So we're not just assessing cyber risk here, we're assessing vendor risk. And part of that onboarding process is making sure that we're not bringing as we say in Europe, a bad egg, or someone that's just not suitable for our organization. They might have all of the capabilities from a security perspective, they might have all of the capabilities from a technical perspective, but they might not fit our culture, just the way they work, their management team, it might not glue together. So all of these decisions need to go in and come up with that whole vendor performance. Coverage, I think we've had plenty of conversations on that, but absolutely we need to make sure we've got that coverage end to end. Vendor risk metrics. So these are what I call the whole KRIs, such as what are the number of security incidents they've experienced, how have they handled them, what are their compliance and regulatory requirements, and equally things like what are their what's their financial stability. And getting those hooks into that broader risk profile is really important. Contract compliance, that might include something like the contract terms, the pricing structure, and ultimately you can see this going a lot broader than cybersecurity. But on that onboarding process, that is something that we've fundamentally got to do. Customer and NPS, how satisfied are their customers? Because ultimately we're going to become one of them. Reference calls, and I'm a big advocate here. The vendor will obviously offer up a couple of customers to have those reference calls with, but ultimately you need to do your own due diligence as well. You need to ask within your networks of your senior stakeholders and understand who has relationships with this particular vendor, what's their particular experience of that as well, because personal recommendations of customers that and trust can go a long way there as well. And then you have the operational metrics as well. So what's their uptime, what's their availability? And this is going to shift and change depending on the service. But setting our stall out up front to actually show this customer that this is an area that we take extremely seriously. And they will get that through this onboarding process. This isn't a company that we ask for a service, they give us a price and we sign on the dotted line. They can see by the process that we're going through that not only do we take cybersecurity seriously, we take data security, we take our compliance, our legal, our operational, commitments to our downstream customers extremely seriously. And that's going to be, obvious based on the conversations and discussions that we're having. And again, we need to, assess beyond cyber, and we've touched on a couple of those risks that can, materialize and present themselves. Things like the shortage of silicon to be able to make computer chips, the Suez Canal being blocked, etc. So there are issues and risks, and geopolitical stability is another one as well. So there are factors that can influence our supply chain that we really need to understand. So reputation risk is key, business continuity risk. So obviously we want to factor in our own business continuity. So is this an area that is so critical to us that we don't award the contract solely to one supplier, and we split that up? So we have two suppliers that that are separated from a geographical status. So if there's a situation like, God forbid, the earthquake that occurred in Turkey, we've got another supplier that can mitigate our supply chain in a different location. So we really have to think these things through as well. We want that process to be global. We've talked about that. We need it to capture everything holistically. We need to make sure that we've got all of these processes flowing through and all the information feeds that we need. But fundamentally, if we haven't got that onboarding process, we're not going to get that right. What I've experienced personally is if you don't get it in the contract at the outset and you start to retrospectively ask for additional things, those additional things put a cost burden on your supplier. And it's up to them whether they reopen contract negotiations or reissue work orders for additional costs based on what we're asking for. So it's really good to get this identified and set from the outset. We don't want to run separate processes for each of these different areas. So we've talked about cyber risk, we've talked about technology risk, we've talked about procurement risk, legal risk. It would be a logistical nightmare if each of these divisions and functions decided to stand up a platform and tool to manage their individual risk profile. And they don't have to, because we have technology that can do that holistically. But us as security professionals need to make sure that their needs and their requirements are factored into that process, and they're getting the right output. They're getting the information that they need to do their job. So we're not just making sure that the security team is good, we're making sure that every stakeholder, those that we put at the outset, really have the information that they need. And if they haven't, we have to adapt to make sure. And we need to make sure that we're in near real time. So businesses operate on a digital footprint now. Information that is hours, days, months, perhaps years out of date is of real little value. So we need that information to be as up to date as possible, and that includes the threat and risk that is present in our supply chain. But equally thinking through proactively, if we've got critical areas that are outsourced, how could we mitigate that in advance? So it's putting that business continuity, it's putting in place that disaster recovery lens as well, thinking through proactively, how would we mitigate this vendor if they were unable to provide that products and services to us. So it really is, thinking that through in advance and putting those hooks and levers in place. Right, so I think that's my final slide. I'm going to hand over to Scott, and I see some questions have come in, and I'm more than happy to answer those at the end. So Scott, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Bryan. If you could advance to the next slide, please. Thanks everybody for sticking into the end here as we, kind of review a little bit of what Bryan said and translate that into, what Prevalent can do to help you address the issue of onboarding, of your vendors and third parties in the organization. Let me start out by saying this. When we talk to customers, they invariably tell us they want to accomplish any one of these three things. Number one, to help them get the data they need to make better decisions. And that data can be at the time of onboarding. That can be the time of making a vendor selection decision even before onboarding. It can be understanding how to assess the vendor based on, the outcomes you want to achieve, getting the data to define and measure KPIs and KRIs, getting, data to determine whether or not, the vendor is compliant with, whatever, regulatory regime you need to align with. Right, good data to make good decisions. Second, increasing team efficiency and breaking down silos. What does that mean? Oftentimes we see, and I think Bryan touched on this a little bit, was in a lot of organizations we see third-party risk owned by, the IT security team, but the relationship is owned by procurement or some combination of different departments, perhaps audit, legal, or others. And each one of these teams, as you well know, each has their own, risks they want to manage or metrics they want to track. And if you do that in silos, it's not going to lead to a very efficient outcome. So break down the silos and increase team efficiency. And then third, evolve and scale your program over time. And by that, I mean, be ready for, an influx of vendors or an outflow of vendors or, changing business requirements, being able to be elastic and agile and scale your program over time. Those three big decisions or outcomes or goals that organizations typically are looking to achieve with regard to third-party risk. Next slide, please, Bryan. What you'll see is that, Prevalent helps to address each of these three goals and outcomes at every stage of the third-party risk lifecycle. And Bryan, you can build it out two more times to kind of complete the slide there. There you go. The first thing we do is we help to add automation and intelligence to sourcing and selection decisions. Good risk-based insights on, cyber, previous breaches, financial health of a particular third-party or supplier, whether or not they have been sanctioned or have any compliance violations against them, whatever. And we help to consolidate that into a risk profile that can help you make a good risk-based decisions on the vendor, much in the same way that you're making a business decision on whether or not that vendor or supplier or partner meets, your company's technical requirements. We add the automation and centralize that information in one particular place. Second, when it comes to intake and onboarding vendors, we help you create a single source of supplier risk profiles, intake processes, contracting, and onboarding workflows, because we've integrated the sourcing and selection, the RFX management, the contracting, and the ongoing due diligence assessment process of third-party risk in a single solution. Then you have a seamless approach to moving that vendor throughout each one of those stages of the life cycle with one set of onboarding workflows, assessment workflows to extend throughout the life cycle. When it comes to scoring inherent risks, as Bryan talked about, we give you the ability to score and categorize and tier vendors based on data-driven insights, typically an internal assessment that then has some external criteria used to sprinkle in to add context. When it comes time to perform a deep controls-based assessment of that third-party vendor or supplier's environment, we give you more than 200 ready-made assessment templates in the platform to streamline the process, of assessing different requirements: security, privacy, ESG, compliance, financial, multiple different domains. We help you monitor and validate those controls over time as well with continuous cyber, business, reputational, and financial insights, so that once you've onboarded the vendor, made a good sourcing and selection decision, onboarded the vendor, got a good inherent risk score and are able to kind of define and execute on your assessment strategy, you can fill gaps in between those assessments and validate their controls as well. Bryan mentioned KPIs and KRIs. With the prevalent platform, you can extract very specific measures and metrics and attributes from contracts and automatically populate those into a central risk register to manage those KPIs and KRIs with distinct owners and measurable delivery dates and more throughout the life cycle. And then finally, every relationship comes to an end. And when it comes time to offboard a particular vendor, terminate a relationship, we give you a very prescriptive checklist and a set of contract terms to evaluate and tasks to complete to make sure that they're offboarded and you're not, leaving data out there or access unterminated, for example, to your environment. At the end of the day, three things here: simplify and speed up onboarding with a single source of the truth and a process to back it up, a single streamlined process to assess vendors across the lifecycle, and then unify teams across that life cycle as well. Next slide, please, Bryan. Very specific to today's topic of onboarding, profiling, and tiering. We talked a little bit about this on the previous slide, but with Prevalent, you can onboard vendors with a spreadsheet upload, an API to an existing system, or an enterprise intake process that's available to all employees that you delegate to. It's a simple out-of-the-box assessment with clear scoring that manages, interacts, inherent risks, helps you tier suppliers based on a bunch of set of different criteria, build a comprehensive profile that includes all of the information about that supplier, firmographic details, ESG scores, modern slavery statements, financial information, fourth-party relationships, and more. And then assess your third parties, and then bring in a bunch of additional intelligence on additional risk domain areas. Next slide, please, Bryan. Speaking of risk domain areas that we cover, just very briefly, we've included a sample here of the 6 primary risk domain areas that we collect information on, either via continuous monitoring, scanning, importing data from outside, or that we collect via internal assessments in the organization. And again, we pull these things together. Next slide, please, Bryan. I think it's my last one. Yeah. So what our goal for you is, what our approach is for you, is to help your organization accomplish 3 things: help you be much more smarter in how you approach third-party risk through performance insights, analytics, role-based reporting, to tie back to that first goal that we talked about, making good risk-based decisions. Second, give you a single source of the truth for the enterprise, combine assessments and monitoring in the same solution, and look at risk across the lifecycle to look at risk in a unified fashion, and tying back to that first slide, to knock down the silos. And then finally, to be very prescriptive in how you assess and monitor and manage your third parties and the relationships throughout that lifecycle with built-in intelligence, automated workflow, and more to help you be agile, grow, and mature your program over time. That's the kind of our approach there, how we build off from onboarding and extend throughout the relationship. That's all I have to share. Melissa, we'll open it back up to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Scott. Now I must ask you all to drop in any more questions that you have into our Q&A box. I had to throw a mustache joke in there because Scott is rocking it. So go ahead and check out your screen. You'll see that second poll come up. And, I'm curious, is there a TPRM project on your radar? I know it's Q2, people are starting to get in gear. If you're looking to establish it, be honest, we do follow up with you. So let's go ahead and get through some of these questions. Bryan, is there any question that sticks out to you more than the others? Because we do have like 6 minutes left.
Yeah, I've just opened it up, to be honest. I can do these quickly. So, someone's asked, how early should we do the risk tiering? Should it be conducted as part of the RFX process? So, I think you can codify your tiering into the RFX process, and Scott's just talked a little bit around that in terms of how Prevalent can assist in taking your prospective supplier through that journey as part of the platform, and you can move them from prospect to customer. But absolutely, you can include that tiering. I think it'll be fairly evident. There's typically 3 tiers within an organization. Are they going to be 1, 2, or 3? you just have to be a little bit cautious. Sometimes supplier owners want their supplier to be lower down than you want them to be down. So you need to make sure that you've got the boundaries clear about where that supplier is gonna be landing. Melissa, is there any other ones you want me to ask? I'm just going down them. Hang on.
Let's see. There's a few, even Scott, maybe some of those might be for you. So maybe you can pick one that sticks out. Leveraging data privacy components into this process. Did you want to answer that one? You want to?
Yes.
Either
Yep.
you or Brian, it's up to you.
Yeah.
Which one is it?
How might you leverage data privacy components into this process, like to leverage intellectual economies of scale?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, Brian, you want to take that first?
Yeah. So let's try to understand what the question. How might you leverage data privacy components into this process to leverage intellectual economies of scale? So I assume this question is, how, data privacy regulations, things like GDPR. So ultimately, we want to make this as seamless as possible. If you're trying to manually assess, exposure to data privacy requirements on your supply chain, that's a fairly onerous process. If, for example, you codify your requirements into a tool like Prevalent, ultimately it becomes a tick of a button or a click of a button to actually say, what is our exposure based on what this supplier is telling us. So in terms of, speed to understand, the answering of audits, are we in breach of data privacy requirements? Are we adhering to data privacy requirements? It certainly comes a lot quicker using a tool like Prevalent. Scott, did you read that in another way, or do you think that's, hit that one?
No, I think I agree with you there. Ultimately, I'll kind of look at it from the Prevalent perspective first. If you have an outsourced, provider, for example, an IT provider that's, managing or touching or accessing your data, you can build a data privacy assessment into your general vendor risk assessment program for that vendor, identify any issues or shortfalls, and then recommend remediations from there. And then implement some level of continuous monitoring so that you can look for your data in the places where it shouldn't be, and can kind of validate whether or not their data security controls are in place.
Perfect. And we do have one question in the chat. I'm going to read it real quick. Since TPRM is an operations process and not a profit center, what can you add about adding value in the capacity of mitigating risk, but controlling overhead to manage the process? Any input on how to achieve this?
Yeah, I think this is a problem that all security functions experience in some way, shape, or form. Security is a cost by default. It's not a profit center at all. And I've been in many boardroom conversations around we need to invest in this capability, etc. And I've had responses like, this doesn't make us any money, etc. But this is ultimately an insurance policy for the organization, not just TPRM, but the entire capability that the security functions offer. And if you've been proactive in investing and doing the right things in this capability, and you have an issue, just like an insurance policy, it'll be there to assist you and help you out. But if you haven't, you'll find yourself exposed and find yourself having those challenges. So I think it's around, recognizing that, being proactive and investing in these spaces will pay dividends in the future. And, nowhere in security, unless you're, a large telco or managed security services provider and you're providing products and services for customers, security doesn't generate revenue typically for an organization. So everything they do is a cost, right? But I think that you need to spin the message on its head and, actually demonstrate the value that the security organization is delivering in terms of, potential risk mitigation, and some of the KPIs and KRIs you can set up or show them that you can set up will help leverage that, right? So it's mitigating potential, spend or exposure that's going to come down the line without this process in place, right?
Perfect. Well, that leaves us at the top of the hour. Thank you, Brian, for coming back, and Scott. Thanks everyone for all your questions. I know we have a few outstanding ones, so feel free to email me directly. I put my email in the chat or info@prevalent.net is always a good one. And lastly, I'm glad you all could join us today, and I'll see a handful of you in your inboxes and at a future webinar. Take care, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.